There it is right there. And now we got sound. And we are live. They missed the intro music, but that's okay. Hakuna Matata for where we're at. So we got good sound now, and I think everybody can probably hear us just peachy. All right, so tonight we're going to continue on from our break earlier. Rabbi, how have you been?
All right, Baruch Hashem.
Yeah, man.
It was pretty nice, although the weather now is like changing very quickly back and forth, so I got a little bit of cold. It's going to be hard for me to talk.
Gotcha.
So if I feel I can't do any further, we'll stop and just continue.
Okay.
In 2 weeks.
Fair enough. Yeah, you have a bar mitzvah next week, yes.
Yeah.
Very good.
Yeah.
Okay.
Another great bar mitzvah.
Wonderful. Okay, so I'll let you carry on, and we will just see where this takes us.
Okay, this week we are starting on a new series in Debunking the Missionaries, number 23, I think as it was. We're going to be dealing with issues regarding the historical Jesus. Now, let me just outline those topics that we're going to be covering within the historical Jesus, so that you know what to look forward to in the weeks ahead. The first thing we're going to do is probably the most important, is Christians claim that Jesus' life is the most documented thing there is. I've seen that claim before, more documented other things. So what we want to do is we're going to first deal with evidence for Jesus outside of the New Testament. How much evidence is there really outside of the New Testament for Jesus' life? That he lived it all, that he was a real person even. Did Jesus exist, for example? Okay. Then we're going to change our direction. Now, until now, we've been dealing with the New Testament and the canon, and we pointed out a number of issues and problems dealing with it, as books as the reliability, for example. Now, excuse me for drinking. I have a very bad, my throat gets dry and I'll start coughing. Horrible. We're going to turn to what the Gospels tells us about Jesus. Remember we talked about how we do know that, in fact, the Gospels were not written by eyewitnesses. They were written over a period of time. And even when they're written, we know that there was actually doctoring and tampering going on, to at least some extent that we know, at least afterwards. And we talked about how beforehand there was probably some doctrine going on. So we're going to second put that aside, those particular doubts we have about the New Testament as an historical document, and look at what the New Testament actually tells us about Jesus. What kind of person was he really? What does the New Testament tell us? What's the real facts as opposed to what the claims are made? And what does Jesus really, when you examine him? Many times will be quoted to me from missionaries that certain scholars or Jewish scholars, whatever, say Jesus was the most Jewish of people there was. So we're going to examine that, whether that was true. So that's the second part we're going to do. The third part is we're going to deal with the New Testament as historical documents. That takes two things. Number one is the New Testament historically accurate in the sense that there are some events that we have clear understanding and we can clearly see from outside the New Testament. So though the events correspond, do they make sense? Are some of the stories right? For example, there's a story about a census that occurred, there's a story about where Jesus was born, where his family was from, a lot of things. And do these really make sense? Do these fit historically? Are there other things within it which give us some doubts as to whether the New Testament is historical at all? And finally, the last thing I do want to deal with, which of course is what we're leading up to, and that's the resurrection. Is the resurrection something that we can call a historical fact, or is it something that they believe to be true but was not? Okay, and we will deal specifically with the most popular defenses of it that we know of, and that's what's known as the minimal facts. Many Christian scholars, William Wayne Craig, Gary Habermas, Michael Kona, others who are apologists for Christianity, and especially dealing with the resurrection, will give what they call their four minimal facts, things that everybody accepts as being true. Do we actually accept them as being true? Is there reasons to believe that they're not true? So we will deal with that. So that's basically our roadmap. It will take us a number of weeks to go through this, and I hope you'll enjoy what we'll go to, and after that we're going to have something else. Okay, so let's start. First question is, we have to ask, did Jesus exist? That there are a number of people who argue, and there has been in recent years certainly, a discussion, did Jesus exist, or is it something made up? Now, I'll let you know right off that I do believe that Jesus was a real person. We're going to discuss here with the perspective of looking at the evidence that might be behind it. But the bottom line is the primary reason why I believe Jesus was an actual real person is because our rabbis believe that he was, that he actually existed. We'll get into discussion of that when we deal with what the Talmud says about Jesus, or if it says anything about Jesus. But the bottom line is something that's very clear, as the rabbis never doubted that Jesus existed. That being the case, then, although people might raise some doubts about it, I do not doubt that he existed, because I agree with the rabbis, what they're saying. Now, what was he most likely? The majority view seems to be that Jesus was most closely associated with the Pharisees. Paul says he was a Pharisee. Most associated with the Pharisees. Now, we discussed a little bit about the Pharisees before. We'll discuss about it continually. But what we see from Josephus is quite clear, as when you say Pharisee, it's basically like saying being Jewish. The overwhelming majority of people follow the Pharisees. Josephus says in two places, book 18 and book 13, that the people followed the Pharisees. That means that they followed whatever was taught by Pharisee rabbis. And I believe it's probably true to say that Pharisee and rabbi was, the word rabbi and Pharisee was probably a synonym. So the people followed them in everything, even in the temple. What the Pharisees said to do was followed. There were a number of the priestly castes who, being from the upper class, were Sadducees, but even they had to follow the Pharisees, as is stated clearly in Josephus. Okay. As far as the other groups who were the Essenes, there is certain instances, certain information which seem to indicate that possibly John the Baptist was, in which case they could have been influenced. But again, if we look at Josephus, he seems to indicate that these were not like Catholics versus Protestants, for example, but they were just like two groups within the envelope, between the umbrella of Judaism. We see that Josephus himself, who was definitely raised a Pharisee, as he claims. However, he did spend some time learning from an Essene, meaning that they weren't so far out. When we talk about rabbinic Judaism, we're going to talk a lot more historical and bring a lot of evidence to show that not only the rabbis today are the direct descendants, in essence, of the Pharisees, but in fact that Pharisaic Judaism was actually the only Judaism in the first century, and even groups like the Essenes were at that time certainly not so far away from the Pharisees. Okay, so that's the first thing. Second thing, what did he believe about himself? I think the evidence is relatively strong. We're going to discuss about some of that. That he believed that he was the Messiah, and that actually the revelation of the Messiah, that the Messiah should come, was imminent. Bart Ehrman refers to him as being an apocalypticist, but that's just a fancy word for somebody who says that they believe the Messiah is coming, and that actually he's coming right now, as opposed to he might be coming tomorrow or the next day. That does not mean that he's not like Pharisees. It's just within the Pharisee group there were people who believed a stronger coming of, the Messiah would be coming earlier rather than later. We see a similar type of thing is where Josephus talks about the Zealots. Zealots were religious nationalists, but he says quite clearly that they were actually part of the Pharisees. The Gemara, the Talmud also indicates that's the same case also. But they just had a certain belief, they had a strong nationalistic belief. It may be that he considered those messianic type people who believed in the coming, the Mashiach quickly, probably in the same category. So in that sense, we would say that Jesus and his followers were people who believed that the Messianic time was coming imminently. And it's pretty strong to believe that he was actually the person who was going to be in that generation the Messiah. And if you're familiar with Josephus at all, you know that in Josephus's time there were a number of people who claimed to be the Messiah, which was quite dangerous because the punishment of doing that when the Romans found out was basically crucifixion and death. Oh, not surprising, is it? Okay, let's go on from here. Now, what I'd like to do is discuss a little bit about history, how we're going to examine it. Now, there's a lot of scholars that write about it, but I'm going to use basically the format of Michaelson, who is a Christian apologist. He does somewhat differ from others, but obviously he's a Christian apologist, so I'll try and play by his rules, or at least somewhat, because there are certain things I do disagree with him. Now, the first thing is I want to go back to and discuss the New Testament documents. Now, according to Michaelson, it's very important to recognize what the New Testament documents were. So, let me read how he describes New Testament documents so you understand. Today, when we talk about a historical document, we assume that because it's historical, it means that every event in it is exactly as it occurred or as close to the facts as possible. We would not accept, as an historical event, for example, something where a person added stories which weren't true. Historians try to know what actually happened and other things. So what he says here is like this. Essentially, the New Testament documents, and we covered some of this earlier, but I just want to repeat it in this place because this is where it belongs. The New Testament documents themselves were not written like modern day histories. They didn't do research like we did. If somebody's writing about World War I, he would do research, go to archives, go to different places, get things together, and write out World War II or whatever, Vietnam War, history of France. He'd go and try and get first-hand knowledge. They weren't interested in writing that kind of a history. He says here, there is somewhat of a consensus among contemporary scholars that the Gospels belong to the genre of Greco-Roman biography. Bios. Bio offered the ancient biographer great flexibility for rearranging the material and inventing speeches in order to communicate the teachings, philosophy, and political beliefs of the subject. And they often included legend. And there's many famous instances of this. For example, many people believe the story in Plato, in his Apology, and the other books dealing with the death of Socrates, that he probably added some things of his own there, even though he might have been there. Others, famous things, of course, Thucydides, where he admits that many of the speeches weren't exactly the way he was. He said it there, but they were like basically the main gist of what it is. Okay. Because bias was a flexible genre, it's often difficult to determine where history ends and legend begins. And this is important to understand. An admission that when it comes to New Testament, we're not sure where one stops and the other starts. Where is it history and where is fact? Now, in the next page, which we mentioned before, we talked about the idea of eyewitnesses. Many times people say, well, if somebody was an eyewitness, that's certainly clear that he knows what happened. But as Lacan here points out again, even if the gospel writers were eyewitnesses, which we've discussed before is certainly not the case, even if they were, that would not ensure that what they're relating actually corresponded exactly to what happened. So this would mostly involve, when we discuss issues like speeches, what Jesus actually said, what were his actual words, did he use these words or not? When you have contradictions in two places in the New Testament, the wording is this way and that way, they both could be wrong. In fact, they're both trying to bring out what Jesus said, but they don't know what they don't have exactly. It's approximate. Now, he says with regards to eyewitness, he notices one thing, that he brings a particular instance here, which is interesting. He brings the instance of the Titanic going down as to whether it broke in half beforehand or after it sank. And some people were there saw it one way, some people another way. And the facts were different. So, the bottom line here, and I don't think he says anything more. Yeah. One more thing that he says here, which I want to repeat again. This is from Michael Cohen. This is not my own. I'm not saying this. Michael Cohen is a well-known apologist. You can look up his name. He is not somebody who does not believe in the New Testament or doesn't believe in Jesus and stuff like that. This is somebody who's considered one of the top ones. He says thus, literary devices such as invented speeches and encomium are common traits of ancient Bible. Thus, in some instances, those who complain of contradictions and inventions in the Gospels are guilty of judging them in terms of photographic accuracy, when this may not have been the intent of the author. What he's trying to say is this, like I said before. If there's a contradiction between one wording what Jesus said and the other wording Jesus said, that he would not consider a problem. Why? Because most likely the author himself writing it down was not writing down what Jesus said anyways. He was saying approximately what he said, what he thought he said, what's close to what he said, but it's not really the actual words that he said. Now, after that, he discusses what we'd say is like theory between history. There's a lot of theories of how do you analyze some documents that are that old. Take Thucydides, History of the Peloponnesian Wars, or Herodotus. We know there are things that are not accurate that are true. So how do we know what we believe? How do we decide how much we're going to believe, what we're going to believe? Now, of course, with Thucydides and Herodotus, it's actually less important in the New Testament. Remember, the New Testament is here to teach you and to give you the life of Jesus, who they claim was the resurrected Messiah. And if you don't believe in him, you go to hell. We're doing something that the historical, the need for historical accuracy is much higher than Thucydides. If Thucydides is incorrect about a certain campaign in the war, in the Peloponnesian War, it doesn't make much of a difference because the end result is we know what happened. We know Athens got sacked. We know what Sparta. We know essentially what happened. Herodotus, we know basically what happened in the war between Persia and the Greeks. If the story that he says is not actually true, whatever, but the bottom line is we know essentially what happened in the end. The Persians were beaten back and the Greeks, and eventually Athens became a big empire. Okay? So we know it's not so important, these things. We don't really care sometimes. It's very nice to know. It's not important. However, when it comes to Jesus, resurrection, birth, virgin birth is a very important issue. Many other things, even his teachings to some extent, are much more important to the accuracy of them than speeches in Thucydides. The speech in Thucydides is not correct. It's one thing. The speech in Jesus, who is considered to be incarnation of the second part of the Trinity, the Word, incarnation of the Word in a human being, that's somewhat important, much more important. And inaccuracies and errors in such things really have much more of a value. So when we analyze it, there's certain ways that you really have to consider it. Okay? Now, Lacona approaches it in a different way. And he says like this: when it comes to material, historical material, there are essentially three approaches that one can have. One is called methodological credulity. What that means is, okay, this guy wrote it, he was near to the time, so we assume that everything right is more or less accurate unless we can find some reason to disagree with it. I say more or less, we look at Josephus that way. Thucydides also that way. More or less, we understand that it's good, it's correct. Maybe the certain biases in Josephus we take into consideration, but essentially, we assume that it's more or less correct. Okay. The next one is methodological skepticism, meaning we assume that it's false, and because we assume it's false, we need to have proof before we accept it as being true. The third is this, methodological neutrality. What this means is we're unbiased. Say it could be true, could not be true, and we see if there's any evidence that would lend us and help us to discern as to whether it is true or not. What is there that this thing tells us that will help us? Now, in general, what he seems to be following is a method more of neutrality, and we'll get into that a little bit later, but I disagree with all three of these, actually. What I believe is a logical analysis of the data. What's that mean? We read what's in there. Is there anything itself which shows it's something contradictory? Is there anything that we see from it that indicates that it might not be true? If the more stuff that we find there that indicates that it has errors in it, the less we will believe it. The more tampering was done with it, the less we can believe it's being accurate. You analyze it as it is. And because of that, depending on the document, will depend on how you do it. So let's look at Josephus. He writes historical stuff. He writes about himself also. He has an autobiography. And in that autobiography, he says a lot of things about himself. But there are some things in there that give us a little bit of reason to believe he might not be being totally truthful about it, and actually building up and exaggerating his self-worth. One example that I give is Josephus claims to be a very learned Pharisee. Now, in his life, he talks about how much education he had. And it ends up that the amount of education he actually had wasn't very much. He said he had 3 years. And of that, at least half the time was spent learning from the Essene, not in the Pharisee, under Pharisees. So anybody who knows a little bit about the Torah itself and the kind of amount of information you have to know pretty much understands that that amount of time is certainly not enough to be considered a very learned Pharisee. Knowledgeable, yes, but it seems that he exaggerates about his importance. Now, since I'm going to be discussing about the resurrection, among historians, we find something that is brought up a lot. One criticism of Bart Ehrman is he assumes that a resurrection cannot occur, for example. Miraculous events cannot occur. So by assuming that the probability of a miraculous event is almost zero, then it automatically discounts anything New Testament and assumes that it's false. Now, in this case, that's not something that I subscribe to. I do, in fact, believe that there are some miracles. In fact, I do believe miracles can be performed by non-Jews, by people, and even in ways that would bring support for idolatrous worship. We have a proof from that actually in the Torah, in Deuteronomy 13, where we're told that it's possible for somebody to come perform miracles and say to come worship idols. And my favorite example of this, of course, is a number of years back. I don't know how many years now. It's probably 15 or more. There was something that happened in India. They have one of their idols there, which has an elephant head. And one of the things they did was they'd give it milk to drink, whatever. And they found when they gave it milk, it disappeared. So there were huge lines all over in the temples, these idolatrous temples in India, I mean London also had no places, where people would take a teaspoon of milk and pour it into the idol, and it would disappear. There wasn't a puddle around, it would just disappear. Many scientists tried to give all kinds of, but the truth of the matter is none of the answers make sense. I mean, you have that many people giving, putting there. There's only so much that can stick to the whatever it's made of from the idol to make it up. Never been in an idolatrous place to know. There should be a whole bunch of water on the floor, milk on the floor from it, but it apparently never was. And interesting enough, when they would interview people coming out, you'd hear them that they would have a great deal of strengthening in their faith from that. That's what Deuteronomy 13 warned us against. So I believe that such things are possible of happening, and in essence, that doesn't mean anything. It doesn't prove anything, but it does mean that I will not, discount the possibility of there being a miracle. I will not discount the resurrection. In fact, we know in the Tanakh there are a number of resurrections in the Tanakh. We should do resurrections. You and we do resurrections. We know that such things happen. Okay. Now, before I go into the historical information about Jesus that we find outside the New Testament, I do want to review some things I said before that relate to this. As we pointed out before, Lakota points out that there are problems with eyewitness testimony. And as we learned before when we were talking about the canon, that until the 2nd century, people actually preferred oral reports to written reports. So taking those two things into consideration and putting them together means that because the New Testament documents were written later, there is a possibility of there being a problem. Now, one of the things that you hear Christians talk about, what was written 10 years later, 15 years, Paul's letters were the earliest written. They were written 20 years after Jesus died. 20 years. So the assumption is 20 years is a long amount of time. It's very hard to get legendary information in 20 years. It's very hard for them. But we'd actually talked before about this instance, about how actual things can change in a very short amount of time. And if you remember, I'll just try and go very quickly. We talked about what's called failed prophecy syndrome. There's a book, When Prophecy Fails, which talked about people who had expected that a flying saucer would come and save humanity. It didn't come, but they didn't lose their faith, and that they became more evangelical after that. And there were a number of books written about that. Another book called Expecting Armageddon, which deals with the same issues with different groups, Jehovah's Witnesses, and that also when their prophecy failed, it didn't come about, they continued in their belief. In fact, in many ways, it became even stronger. Jehovah's Witnesses shouldn't even be around because they prophesied that Jesus was supposed to come over 100 years ago, and yet they're still here because they revised what they believed. They changed what it is, and they changed what would come out of it. Now, this is important to understand. These things happen not after 40, 50 years. These happen very, very early. Okay? I brought two instances from Judaism where we actually see the same thing, where a prophecy failed and where it continued on redefining what was the whole purpose of their messianic character. The first was with Shabtai Tzvi. What happened with Shabtai Tzvi, as I said before, is he converted to Islam. And what happened is they developed a whole theology based around the Messiah having to become an apostate in order to perform certain kinds of things, Kabbalistic types of things. A total redefinition. And this didn't happen 50, 60 years later. It happened in the time while he was still alive. It was being proposed, and it didn't take very long to do. It doesn't take a long amount of time for a total redefinition of the meaning of the message to change, or for anything of that nature. Now, the same thing we talk about in Lubavitch with the late Lubavitch Rebbe. There were many people who believed he was Mashiach. And when he was alive, it was categorically written that it's impossible for the Mashiach to die. He could not die. Not possible. He would have to complete everything. This is the truth of the matter. This is the simple reading of the Maimonides, and this came as part of certain fundamental beliefs that in the Lubavitch they had that we had in other places. So, for example, the belief that in every generation, if we merit one person is of such a level, one person is of such a level that person is worthy to be Mashiach. That was something that's not only in Lubavitch, it's a pretty accepted custom, a pretty accepted idea in Judaism. I also mentioned that one of the people who later becomes one of the biggest followers of Mishiachis, they call them, wrote when the Lubavitch Rebbe was alive that it's simple that the Mashiach is not going to die. It would be total contradiction with what the Rambam said. And also following that, the Lubavitch Rebbe himself wrote that the Mashiach is going to be a soul in the body. And so all these things written when the Lubavitch Rebbe was alive clearly indicated that, if he was Mashiach, there were many people in Lubavitch believed in Mashiach. So if it had been the case that he was one who was worthy in the adoration of Mashiach, if he would die, then he would be. And somebody else would have to be. But what happened when he died? Within hours, there was a huge number of people in Crown Heights who believed he would immediately be resurrected, but they didn't die at all. In fact, it was reported that people were actually dancing and singing. Very difficult to understand. I mean, he's not the first Rebbe that died. Two of my Rebbes have already died, and so we didn't dance and sing. It's a person passes off to the next world, even though they have a great reward in the world, and even though we still feel connected to our Rebbes, even if they leave, it's still they're not here anymore. They finished their job here, what they were supposed to be. But even within the first days, there were people, immediately there were people dancing and singing because it felt that he should immediately resurrected and be Mashiach. Within a short amount of time, they figured out how to deal with it. And so nowadays, there's a large amount of people in Lubavitch who believe that, in fact, either the Lubavitch Rebbe is not dead, there's some of those, or they believe that, in fact, he is, but he's going to be resurrected and be Mashiach. Okay. The amount I don't know. I've heard from different sources. Some say it's larger, some small. It's not really interesting, not really important. Why? Because the issue is only that we do see that people can change their whole theology virtually overnight. It doesn't take 10 years. It doesn't take very long. Remember, the first council in Jerusalem, that's in Acts 15, took place over 10 years later. More than enough time for them to change the theology, adapt it, come together and decide what they're going to do in the future. More than enough time. Within 3 or 4 years, Lubavitch was pretty much those groups who were Mashiachists and believed it, pretty much had everything down straight. What's even more is, remember, at the time of Jesus, they didn't have, videos, internet, all this kinds of stuff. I mean, nowadays you have, where they have the Lubavitch Rebbe, they have videos that were taken from his talks, and they play them virtually 24 hours a day in different places. You can see it, maybe not 24 hours a day, but I know when I went to Eretz to Maran for Lag BaOmer, there were Lubavitches there that had a big screen there, and you could see the Lubavitch Rebbe talking, although he'd been dead almost 20 years then. So even though we have been The funeral was actually videotaped. It was there. A lot of people were there. People who alive were there. Still, there are people who believe he's still alive. And there's people who believe that he's, not buried in Queens. That in fact, in Queens, in the cemetery, the tomb is actually empty. There are many of those also. And there's others who believe he's just going to be resurrected. But the point of the matter is, when the Lubavitch Rebbe was alive, that was not ever the case. There are clearly things that were said by the Lubavitchers themselves. As soon as he died, they changed it. So this does affect our looking at the inyan of the idea of the historicity of the New Testament. Okay, there's one more issue I want to discuss before we get to dealing with those sources of Jesus outside the New Testament. And I'll leave it at that. One of the things that we're going to be looking at when we examine the New Testament itself is from a historical point of view, not from a theological, historical point of view, is whether some of these contradictions we're going to have really have implications for our belief in the historical accuracy of the New Testament itself. Now remember, when we looked at the canon, one of the points that we looked at is how books were taken into it, what kind of implication that does. Does it imply that in fact the process was under divine guidance or not? We looked at the tampering that was done, those cases that we know for sure. And so we look at what does that tell us about how trustworthy those people who were involved with it, and if they weren't trustworthy afterwards, if they were willing to put things there, what does it tell about beforehand? So in the same sense, we're going to look at instances in the New Testament, and we're going to sit back and say, okay, does this give us more or less confidence or neutral about whether we should accept the New Testament as historical fact? So that is going to be one of the things we're going to have to always keep in mind. Now, getting back to Lacona, what I'd like to say is that although I mentioned that my view is, of course, that we have to use a logical analysis, if I was, from what we discussed until now, going to have to choose out a specific methodology, I would have to say that the information we have so far tells us we really have to start out with methodological skepticism. We have to assume that these errors that we find, they're an indication that, in fact, the historical nature of that is suspect, and we really need to have some proof behind whether it's there. To be selection process, but the fact that none of the writers of the Gospels were actually eyewitnesses, for example. All these things lead to us to think that we need to have a little bit of skepticism. And there's one point that's not usually brought up, and that's to remember, why were these books written? Okay. These books were not written just to tell histories or stories about, a famous person. These books were written for a specific purpose. That specific purpose was to tell other people about the life of Jesus, in order to convince them that Jesus was the person that they were telling these stories about, that the claim of these stories prove. Messiah, Son of God, whatever these stories were said to be for. So in that case, because of the nature of the gospel accounts themselves, we have to naturally be more skeptical than we would about something that was just written without any kind of proving. I mean, Thucydides was not writing about the Peloponnese Wars in order to prove something about Athens, Sparta, or Corinth, or anything like that. He was writing it in order to tell just history, what happened, and so that for later generations, people can learn from that and understand why these events took place. Okay, I think I'm going to stop now because I'm going to start coughing pretty much in a few minutes.
Okay.
If there's anybody has a question about the material I was talking about so far, I would very much go into it.
All right, let me see if I can find. See if there's any.
If Dan, you had a question, or if you want somebody who wants to call in.
It's okay. Let's see. Pull up my live streaming here. So, give me just a minute. I had it actually pulled up, but it closed out on me earlier. 1 second. Channel. There we go. All right. Move this down where I can actually see it. There we go. It's better. Okay, I don't see right off the hand any questions. I see some comments, but just conversations between people.
Well, what are the compliments?
Oh, that would take me forever to read everything. Let's see if I can find something thick here. I don't see anything so far in the form of a question. Yep. Yep. Okay, Paul Brewer, can Rabbi talk about dispensationalism? Okay, that's the first question. Is that correlating with our topic for tonight? Would be the question. Because if not, we can wait on that till later.
No, I don't think dispensationalism would probably if we get into it, but that doesn't really come up.
Okay, gotcha. Okay, cool. Well, we can wrap it up then, and we'll and carry on. Pick up next week, same time. Actually, not next week. 2 weeks from now. Next week, you've got your bar mitzvah you have to deal with. Very good.
Yep.
Very good. All righty.
Okay.
Well, that sounds like a plan. All right, Rabbi. Well, thank you for your time.
Okay. Bye-bye.
You bet. Have a great night. You guys, we'll see you same time, same place, as Shem willing. Until then, Shavuot Tov. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
חשוב מכל חשוב והכרחי להיות ביחד. איפוק זו העוצמה, ויתור זו הגדולה, השאיפה